Thank you for being here today. This program is about the legacy of a visionary leader of the dynamic natural world and man's relationship to it, Gilbert White. His legacy and life's work is our focus here today, beginning with the treatise he wrote decades ago and the relevance of those principles today. For some of you, Gilbert White's a stranger, but to others, his long life overlapped with your work life. To both groups, let us inspire you with this program today. First, we have a disclaimer, of course, that these are the views of the esteemed speakers today and don't necessarily reflect those of any companies, ASFPM, or the Foundation. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to outstanding speakers today. They are deep thinkers and experts where we are and the challenges we face today and in the future. We do want to talk about why we chose this topic. At the time, our nation was struggling with flooding events when Gilbert was active in his geography and his treatises. And there were states at the same time recovering from a world war and flooding. It fell on a young geographer to author publications focused on policy and the real-world implications of research. His consistent questions of his students' research was, what are the policy implications? His greatest legacy may lie in the example he offered to those despairing of our society's ability to cope with the environmental challenges we faced. Gilbert's faith in humankind's potential for improvement never dimmed. I personally was charmed and inspired by this great man's life and work and hope that it inspires you or re-inspires you today. While we're recognizing great floodplain leaders, we want to stop a minute and salute our own Larry Larson. And Terra Nova, who's a foundation board member, will provide our honor to Larry today.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm truly honored to recognize Larry Larson, ASFPM Director Emeritus and Senior Policy Advisor, and his contributions to ASFPM, the ASFPM Foundation, and overall to the floodplain and flood risk management community. Without his passion and his dedication to our profession, there is a strong likelihood that we wouldn't be here today. I first met Larry in 1995 at the ASFPM conference in Portland, Maine. At the time, I was supporting response efforts in the aftermath of the 93-94 Midwest floods. My company had an assignment under FEMA's new Hazard Mitigation Technical Assistance Program, where we were conducting environmental assessments for mitigation actions in communities along the Illinois River. I was responsible for the public involvement portion of the work, and Dale Lehman, our current foundation president, suggested I present on our work at the Portland conference. It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, in the words of Humphrey Bogart. Larry's lifetime of service began early in his career as a water resources engineer on a large project with the California Department of Water Resources. After its completion, he returned to Wisconsin, where he oversaw floodplain management for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Beginning in 1975, Larry consulted with Dr. Gilbert White and the Natural Hazard Center during summer workshops in Boulder, Colorado. And in 1977, he led the establishment of ASFPM, which at the time was primarily comprised of the 6 upper Midwestern states. In 1979, ASFPM held its first official meeting, and by then, 19 states were represented. During this meeting, Larry was elected as the association's chair, and in 1982, he was named the executive director, where he served in this position until 2012, 30 years later. Today, the association and its 38 chapters represent well over 20,000 flood risk management professionals from across the U.S. and is the leading voice for sound floodplain management practices and policies. The association's progress and accomplishments in flood risk mapping, mitigation, and insurance reform, it didn't happen overnight. Often, small incremental steps were needed, and Larry Larson was there every step of the way. As a co-developer of ASFPM's No Adverse Impact Initiative, his frequent expert testimony to Congress, and his role on FEMA's National Advisory Council are but a few accomplishments that warranted the change in ASFPM's Premier Award to the Larry Larson Meritorious Lifetime Achievement in Floodplain Management Award. On behalf of all of us, we simply want to say thank you, Larry. Well done, my friend.
If you had to name one person in our history who tackled the problem of floods, it would be Gilbert White. He started his career during a period of particularly devastating floods in the United States, floods that displaced hundreds of thousands of people.
And I first started getting serious interest in flood problems in 1934. I had finished work for a bachelor's degree and a master's degree at the University of Chicago, Department of Geography. And I was about to start on my doctorate dissertation on floods when my supervising professor said, would I come to Washington and work with him for 8 months on a study of the Mississippi Valley waters, including floods and irrigation. So I went off to Washington for 8 months, and I stayed 8 years.
Gilbert White was obviously one of the founders of what we know as floodplain management in our lives here today. What we need to do when we're looking at Gilbert White is his work was done back in 1942, and it is amazing, and published in 45, and it is amazing how many problems that he outlined then are with us today. So I think it's really important to remember that those who cannot remember the past are condoned to repeat it. So we could be at a crossroads of reinventing what floodplain management is in the United States. And now's the time for us to really go back and study the roots of the problem going forward. His publication on human adjustment of floods is a masterpiece. It's 238 pages long and outlines all the problems of the day, which in essence, when I read it, are almost identical to the problems that we have now. So next is a short video of, in essence, a little bit of background of Gilbert White.
Gilbert White didn't just stay in Washington. He worked his way up to the White House. It wasn't long before he was advising President Franklin Roosevelt on matters of natural resources. And in his spare time, he was writing a doctoral dissertation for the ages, Human Adjustment to Floods. In this dissertation, he articulated with an unprecedented clarity how structural efforts to control nature, like dams and levees, might actually enhance the problem, might make it more intractable. Gilbert argued instead that the path to resilience was a balance between structural approaches and softer approaches that had to do with people's use of land. Instead of moving water away from people, he argued that people should move away from water. So moving forward to the 1960s, Gilbert White was asked to review the idea of a national flood insurance program. He's interested in this as an incentive for communities to adopt more resilient practices. He had seen how challenging it was to get enforceable regulations, so he was looking for an incentive The flood insurance wasn't an end in itself. It was designed to encourage communities to adopt and enforce better floodplain regulations. But Gilbert was concerned, wary. He spoke openly about the threat that subsidies to that insurance, charges below the rates that the private market would support, would aggravate the whole flood problem if not very carefully managed and thoughtfully implemented.
So in Gilbert's dissertation, he talks a lot about human adaptation, and he has 7 factors that he looks at in detail: land elevation, land use changes, flood abatement, flood protection, everything from levees to channel improvements, cutoffs, and floodways, structural arrangements to roads and buildings, emergency measures, and public relief and risk transfer mechanisms through here. Now, the existing formula that has lasted a long time to justify a project that was in his paper was basically looking at the benefits of protection versus the cost of protection. And if that's greater than 1, the project should move forward. What Gilbert looked at was, let's take advantage of all the advantages of this site, of what we're doing. And what are all the disadvantages? And the disadvantages could even mean that if you're displacing a person to then have to move to an area that is a higher rent district, taking that into account. If you're taking into account that people that might now become unemployed because of this particular project, taking that into account. So he was really looking at the holistic view of what are all the advantages and what are all the disadvantages of the project. Now, in his paper, he identified 2 primary groups when I was going through here. One was large public utilities, and others was separate buildings. And he looked at these back in 1942, okay, and said, basically, the large public utilities have gotten their act together, okay? You know, the railroads, the highways, the electrical distribution systems, they're understanding the floods of record and going through. Where we have problems is with the homeowners and the businesses reaching forward on this. They are not, because of the subsidies that are taken into account and lessen the risk, they are not fully adapting to the floods that occur. A really good quote that he had on page 199 of his dissertation I pulled out was, "The policy therefore encourages present occupants of floodplains to remain where they are by helping to minimize the economic shock of flood losses. If no relief were given, flood sufferers would be inclined after every flood to consider whether or not the advantages of floodplain outweigh the disadvantage of the flood hazard." Okay, a very, very important concept.
What I'd like to do is dive a little bit into land management and flood risk reduction. And we'll start here with another video.
The devastating floods kept coming.
1916, 1922, 1937. We built 100 cities and 1,000 towns, but at what a cost?
Gilbert's work had been growing in reputation during this time, and much of that stemmed from his insight, which was summarized in this quote: "Floods are acts of God, but flood losses are largely acts of man." Let that sink in a bit.
So as you're letting that sink in, I wanted to align some of that thinking with what our essentially modern day risk equations. And if you think about it at the highest level, these equations are pretty straightforward. There's a probability of something happening multiplied by the consequences should it happen. And I think what Gilbert White was saying is that humans actually control about half of that equation. We control the consequences side of the risk equation. And I think he understood this really well. So when he talks about human adjustments to floodplains, he's essentially saying, let's look at that half of the equation, the consequences side of the risk equation. And so it's really important, I think, to recognize he also understood the importance of owning our choices. One thing I think he made very clear is that you can't blame God or Mother Nature for the decisions that we make. And I would say, especially given today's technology and the insights we have into flooding, we know there are probabilities that these floods will occur. And so when you look at that probability side of the equation, we do own a little bit of it. I think it was touched on earlier today. We can build levees and floodgates and flood walls and reduce the probability of water getting to land. But I think Gilbert made it very clear, trying to move water away from things is a very costly endeavor. And so adaptation by humans has to be part of the process. So the good news is that we own at least half, I would say maybe even more of the equation, which gives us an advantage and can allow us to prosper going forward. So when it comes to the wise use of floodplains, I would say Gilbert stood out in his time. There was a lot of talk of flood control in the 30s and 40s. That kind of hubris, I don't think, helped us in the long run. He also made it very clear that infrastructure alone was not a silver bullet, that overdependence on expensive infrastructure solutions that moved water could over time lead to these unintended negative financial, environmental, and social consequences. He proposed balance and advocated for a proper accounting of both using structural interventions and human adaptations. And so for me, what I take away from some of his writing is that really wise use means considering both the potential benefits and the risks associated with human occupation in flood-prone areas. So Dr. White recognized the need for this adaptive and continuous risk-reward balancing process that I don't think today we've completely embraced. I think he also touched on this idea that advocating for the extremes isn't really helpful, suggesting that all people everywhere should avoid all flood hazards is not really practicable, and that occupying every floodplain in every condition was also not practicable. So debating the extremes is not really, in my opinion, a very useful way to spend our time. But talking about the in-between those two extremes, I think, is a place where we can find some consensus and begin to move forward. So I would say I think Gilbert was way ahead of his time. In some ways, I think he may be a little bit ahead of even our current time. We do have the tools and we can muster the resources and the smarts to bring his balanced approach into practice. But it is going to require that we, in some cases, as practitioners, lead the leaders in our nation. Some of them, I think, lack the will to tackle the challenge because it is complicated. This sort of binary thinking around occupancy or non-occupancy, I think, cages us and pushes us into sort of a victim mentality about, well, if I had known, I don't have any control over flooding, I don't have any control over the flood consequences. I don't think these are healthy discussions to be having. So complete avoidance, again, is not the solution in my mind, and complete occupation is not either. So the real challenge, I think, for us is to put a lot of the ideas that Gilbert had in the 1940s to practice. And so WISE, in my mind, means a rational solution that's somewhere between the two extremes. And in order to bring Gilbert White's thinking into practice, I think we need to start using some tried and true flood risk management strategies.
So what I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about are flood standards, and my subtitle on that is Losing Sight of the Big Picture.
Gilbert was also deeply concerned about using the 100-year flood standard as the basis for any future insurance program. The selection of this standard was essentially experimental, merely a starting point. He was told by the NFIP administrator it would be assessed and changed if needed as time progressed.
I was chair of the special committee that was set up by the Bureau of the Budget and that wrote the report on the idea of having national flood insurance. And our task force was quite explicit in saying that there should be an appraisal of, after a few years, of what would seem to be the effect of the regulations. But it is also fairly clear that there is not interest in the part of the government at present in re-examining the idea of using the 100-year flood as a criterion.
The challenges with the 100-year floodplain, at the time, it was really a bold statement of trying to get people to think about a common standard. But there was also some give and take. What was conceived for the purposes of the NFIP became a de facto standard for floodplain management. Floodplain management and flood insurance are now linked to the same standard by practice. Is the approach adequate to manage the nation's vulnerability, i.e. is the 1% or 100-year correct in all places? And also, at the time that standard was adopted, stationarity was assumed in climate, so the notion of future conditions and climate change was not yet part of what we were thinking. But I think if you look at this quote from Gilbert, he said, when I asked if they had ever considered looking into a floodplain to see what happened there, as distinct from computing the losses that would be experienced or averted, they said they were not interested in that. And when I look at that quote, I think we're looking very much at the discussion of standards. To the engineer, the flood standard is essentially something you design to. When you take a look at it from a geographer's perspective, it's defining the geographic area and the resource which you're going to manage. And so from the start of Gilbert's dissertation, moving into this, we have moved away from this geographic approach into an engineering and actuarially based approach, which I think we need to think through. So do we really have a floodplain management standard? I would say no, we have a floodplain construction standard. And I think that's an important thing to understand as we're moving forward with the work that Gilbert laid out where we are today. So what are some of the consequential discussions we've had about these flood standards? Well, if you go back to 2004, the ASFPM Foundation did a forum related, named after Gilbert White, related to the 1% flood itself. And there were some positives and there were some negatives. It recognized the significant contribution of the standard in bringing more than 20,000 communities to the National Flood Insurance Program. That was a huge win. But we also saw that one standard fits all was not the right approach. And also at that time, it began to foreshadow that flooding was getting worse due to climate and future conditions. Fast forward to recent times, FEMA Risk Rating 2.0. If you look at FEMA Risk Rating 2.0, there's many contributions that are brought forth, but one was the notion of continuous risk, was for the first time being applied and being looked at from an insurance side. We have not yet thought about that from a standard side. Then there was the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, the federal government's response to climate change and increasing sea level rise and other factors. It only applied to federal construction. It was not across the board everywhere. It was designed to account for uncertainty in climate. It allowed for climate-informed science, but essentially was a freeboard approach. But unfortunately, due to politics over the last 8 to 10 years or so, it's been an on again, off again standard where we have actually stepped away from it currently, even though this standard can be found in the Defense Act and some other policy elements. And now, most recently and currently, ASCE 24-24 has come out with a new document that is looking at trying to change the flood standard. The two elements that they're looking at is a 500-year standard for floodplain regulations for residential and commercial structures, or a 750 to 1,000-year standard for critical facilities. But I take us back to this quote again. When I asked if they had ever considered looking into a floodplain to see what happened there, as distinct from computing the losses that would be experienced or averted, they said they were not interested in that. And what I would suggest is that while we're applying current thinking about what that standard might look like, we're still getting trapped into the notion of a standard as opposed to what is within the floodplain. So I think some of the things that we would be looking at that would be consistent with what Gilbert imagined is that we need to make sure that floodplain management continues to embrace land use, natural functions, flooding dynamics, but it also is one that could be supported by AI-driven strategies and robust data infrastructure that could cause us to look at this resource in a different way. We should move away from one-size-fits-all standards. We need to go back in, and this is one area I think that gets into the holistic view that Gilbert had. We need to go back into a document called the Unified National Program, and we need to find our path forward again. We've lost that path for a variety of reasons, and I'm even suggesting to the point where perhaps a coalition needs to pull that update out from where it has been traditionally updated and move for the future. And with that, I will turn it over to David Marstead.
All right. Okay, so let's talk about flood insurance and how flood insurance fits in to this conversation.
Today, of course, floods have gotten more frequent, they've gotten more severe, and the costs of the program have exploded. The claims against the flood insurance program amount to tens of billions of dollars. The forgiven claims amount to $16 billion. But those figures don't speak to the total cost of failure to adjust to the flood problem. The cost in human suffering, devastated lives, individual financial calamity, social disruption, health problems, death itself. Those scenes from Gilbert's early years are still repeating, and so were the costs. The good news is we've got a strong FEMA. We've got a well-equipped, well-trained, highly motivated, passionate workforce. They're working domestically and abroad. They're working at state and local levels with tribal nations, and every piece of FEMA, including the National Flood Insurance Program, is contributing.
Well, let me start by suggesting there is a lack of understanding about all of the things that my colleagues discussed. And as a result, there is too much emphasis on insurance, especially when discussing whether the NFIP is successful or not. So to kick my discussion off, what were Dr. White's thoughts about the role insurance plays in the flood problem? Let's look at his dissertation. Insurance isn't addressed until toward the end on page 200, and then only 5 pages devoted to the subject, which suggests to me that he believed all the other challenges with the flood problem were more significant. Furthermore, he focuses more on the fact that the private sector was unsuccessful at providing a stable flood insurance market and the feasibility of one ever developing. But he does leave the door open that some type of a national program may be possible under certain circumstances, albeit with a lot more study. One such circumstance is a government guarantee. If a great flood occurred in a densely settled area, the additional funding required would be provided. It doesn't mention treasury loans, but I'll get to that later. Dr. White also raises concerns about the difficulty in computing risk. Rather astute. He identifies the social behavior obstacles of individuals preferring to depend on public relief and unlikely to maintain the coverage following dry years or when floods seem improbable. Spot on again. Dr. White seemed convinced that public relief, or the belief that public relief will surface, would have two detrimental impacts. First, human suffering be reduced in such a way to promote the causes for even greater suffering in the future. And second, serves as a rationalization to forego insurance protection. He did highlight a key point, stating that the availability of flood insurance may provide significant benefits with regards to facilitating sound adjustments to floods. In essence, he believed that flood insurance may serve as an essential incentive for communities to adopt more resilient practices, as without such incentives, most communities likely would not proactively undertake the initiative. Dr. White also expressed concerns that rates not reflective of the actual hazard, less than private market, would exacerbate the situation. Pretty astute. Finally, Dr. White advised that insurance must be carefully managed and thoughtfully implemented. So keeping all that in mind, let's move to the establishment of the NFIP and the role insurance played. To be clear, it was not about creating a national insurance solution. It was all the stuff my colleagues have addressed. Insurance enters the picture as the incentive, the quid pro quo, to be the catalyst to achieve how the U.S. flood problem would be addressed, as Dr. White suggested. A key to the congressional response to the flood problem was establishing the ability for the federal government to intervene. Land use is the purview of local government, so participation needed to be voluntary. The primary purpose, adopt and enforce better local floodplain management regulations to make a real dent in the nation's flood problem. Has it worked? Has it not worked? Let's talk again about the 1% annual chance event as the minimum federal standard that evolved into the gold standard and the impact to insurance. Dr. White was very concerned about the institutionalization of the 1% annual chance standard. He believed it should only be the starting point with the need for assessment and periodic review. Why? Everything is triggered off the minimum federal standard. Floodplain management, risk identification, grants. The fact that there was never the political will, which by the way will only happen with the significant public pressure, is the key reason we find ourselves where we do today, 6 decades later. A few other observations. There was a very slow start to participation, even with the incentive of insurance. So, fix with sticks. Tie community participation to disaster assistance eligibility. For individuals, the mandatory purchase requirement, both of which led to negative unintended consequences. This participation drive also led to a mindset by those administering the program to prioritize affordable rates, which the Flood Insurance Act didn't call for. According to the Act, rates were supposed to be reasonable. And while many don't want to accept this distinction, I do. And I remind you, this was a warning from Dr. White, rates which were not aligned with the hazard. I've also been concerned for some time that the focus for flood mitigation to help address the flood problem was too much on insurance premium savings versus all the other reasons why mitigation should be sought and achieved. Actions driven either to reduce the cost of insurance or even drop or avoid coverage. In the development of a community rating system, again, good intention, promote sound floodplain management and best practices. Incentive, flood insurance discounts. I don't think it was ever the intent for insurance to be a necessary evil, but in my mind does play a part in the flood insurance gap and the financial strength of the insurance operation and thus the program. So this week, we remember Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. I was there 20 years ago. So I look back with many memories, reflections, and feelings. I recall flying into New Orleans, seeing not a light on anywhere. I recall driving through the rubble along Mississippi coastline over 10 feet high, the destruction, lives impacted, and disaster suffering so totally unfathomable. 250,000 flood insurance claims, over $17 billion in claim payments, over 8 times the previous record. All of my briefings to the FEMA administrator, DHS leadership, OMB, and congressional members, this would come up. How could this happen? Well, it's a catastrophic program structured where a basic insurance principle is violated, concentration of risk. Unlike other events like fire, hail, or tornado, not 10 insurance companies responding, just one, the NFIP. I heard it's bankrupt, it's broken. Something needs to be fixed, echoed across DC. Well, yes. Let's start with the design of the program. Discounts, subsidies, artificial pricing. There's so much more that could be said, but let's leave it at that for the purpose of today. Dr. White addressed this. Everyone, including the federal government, needs to be prepared for such an event because of the nature of the hazard. My point is, because of the reaction and the belief or hope the insurance operation could be self-sufficient, the outcome was the program was forced to take on debt. Clearly not what Dr. White had in mind. NFIP lands on the GAO high risk list, and the entire program, not just the insurance piece, suffers from the negativity, a failed government program. And yet, no movement since 2017 by Congress to anything about it.
But the disasters continue to roll on and roll over us. Costs are mounting, the frequency are going up, the number of people impacted is going up. We're losing ground on this problem. We're increasing our exposure in hazardous areas. We're still building and rebuilding in floodplain. So the big news is future problems are going to dwarf the problems of the past. We have to be realistic about the future. We've hardwired a lot of vulnerability into the system over the last 50 years by building too low, by building extensively in the floodplain, by building inadequately. And those vulnerabilities are going to be exposed. That climate is going to have more extremes. They're going to be of greater magnitude, greater duration. They're going to be occurring and reoccurring in time short compared with our ability to recover.
Let me wrap up. Dr. White stated it is necessary to build a sense of responsibility into our actions. As the NFIP evolved to meet today's needs, as you heard in the video, the challenge, increasing exposure, continued building and rebuilding in flood-prone areas. We've hardwired a lot of vulnerability. Future problems dwarf the problems of the past. Path forward, just try to make it better than it is. Just look at and correct the mistakes of the past. What has occurred in the last 60 years was by the rules. Don't the rules need to be changed? Part of the problem is the evaluation of the NFIP many times focuses on the wrong things. Costs of the NFIP usually framed in amount of losses, premium shortfall compared to claim payments. The insurance operation is in debt, failure. The insurance operation continues to provide coverage to thousands of multi-loss properties, failure. The maps are outdated. Damage from events occur outside the high-risk zone, and there are more properties without insurance protection than have, failure. Communities don't adequately enforce local regulations, failure. I'm convinced that when transforming the NFIP or discussing reauthorization of the NFIP, the effort must be about all elements of the NFIP and not just the insurance operation. Fortunately, FEMA has developed a comprehensive suite of recommendations to set the NFIP on the right path. But I believe it is also time that the objectives of a contemporary NFIP be established, a new look at what the program should achieve and what needs to be done to make it happen. A few ideas to jumpstart the discussion. Gilbert White believes setting premium rates upon the basis of the hazard such that insurance would emphasize differences and make property owners more sensitive to their individual risk, which would stimulate the movement of unsound occupancy out of floodplains, which would lead to areas that did not require protection and thus reduce federal disaster costs, disruption, disaster suffering. Or said another way, rate adequacy should be a prime requirement for the NFIP going forward. A contemporary objective of the National Flood Insurance Program should embrace closing the flood insurance coverage gap. This can be achieved by establishing a funded affordability program for lower income households and individuals caught in high-risk situations. Moreover, it is essential to mitigate any unintended consequences associated with mandatory purchase requirements. It is imperative to develop a contemporary objective for the NFIP that surpasses the existing federal minimum standard based on the 1% annual chance event. This objective should encompass all variables and sources of flooding. The methodologies for measuring and communicating flood risk must be revised accordingly. A contemporary NFIP objective should be developed to identify, promote, and achieve floodplain management aiming to reduce disaster suffering by minimizing loss of life, property damage, community resources, and economic loss. A contemporary NFIP objective should encompass a financial architecture that acknowledges the distinct challenges inherent in managing catastrophic risk insurance operations and harmonizes policyholder affordability with taxpayer responsibility for a beneficial societal advantage. A contemporary NFIP should explicitly outline the necessary actions to enhance the natural and beneficial characteristics of the floodplains, as well as specify the practices that should be avoided to accomplish this objective. Believe me, not a comprehensive list. Don't expect universal agreement. But let's do agree that the NFIP, all of it, is worth protecting and, dare I say, fighting for.
And so we have a social challenge in front of us. As Gilbert said, disasters are largely a human construct. In the same way, resiliency can only be a human construct. It's up to us to harness tomorrow's tools to deal with these challenges of the future. But more importantly, more fundamentally, as Gilbert the Quaker, as Gilbert the humanitarian would say, we have to build a sense of responsibility into our actions. We need to do that if we're going to get past adjustment to floods as an aspiration and get to adjustment to floods as a reality.